Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire have gained a reputation as a series where anyone can die at any time. While this idea seems to be fairly just broad and not necessarily what happens in the series, as these deaths seem to be more based in characters' actions, consequences, and surrounding circumstances, it is true that there is a very high number of characters who die in this fairly realistic world. That leads to a lot of speculation as to the future of the series, at least for those of us who still believe there will be a Winds of Winter. And today I'm going to begin speculating on exactly who I think will die or live in the next book in A Song of Ice and Fire. Specifically, I'm going to be going through the 20 viewpoint characters who are still alive as of the end of A Dance with Dragons, and speculating on whether or not I think they will live, die, or something in between for the future of the Winds of Winter. This won't get into a Dream of Spring territory. I'm strictly talking about the next book, and when looking at the exact format of it, the higher percentage I give them is a higher percentage chance of survival. So 100% chance means I think they'll definitely survive. 0% chance is I think they're 100% a goner. I was initially going to do betting odds, but it's occurred to me that I don't know how betting works. Starting off with the first alphabetical and thus most important viewpoint character, we have Aeron Greyjoy, the drowned priest and uncle of Asha and Theon. He lives on Pike for the first few books until he is eventually captured by Euron, where we find him early on in the Winds of Winter. As his sample chapter says in its first sentence, he's currently in the belly of the beast. He's been taken from island to island, strung along by his brother, and now literally tied to the deck of a ship, and seemingly being prepared as part of a massive blood sacrifice to wake something from the deep and get Euron out of his dire straits with the red wines. This is a very interesting predicament, and I do think that out of all of the characters we're going to list today, Aeron is one of the more likely characters to die. I honestly put his percent chance of survival of the Winds of Winter, I would guess around 10%, as I think he's unlikely to survive his run-ins with Euron. I mean, it'd be cool if he did, as the Forsaken chapter rules, and you should read it, but I don't think it's particularly likely. Moving from one important viewpoint to the next, we have Areo Hotah, the camera that rides. This Dornish guardsman is going off to find Darkstar somewhere in Dorne as of the beginning of the Winds of Winter, and we know there will be multiple chapters from his perspective, according to George R.R. Martin. Areo Hotah is somebody I'm pretty torn on in terms of his future in the series. While he doesn't have much personality so far, I do think as someone who is so tied to oaths and things he has sworn, he could have potentially very interesting arcs in the Winds of Winter if he is to get a bit more focus. However, he is someone who is fairly disposable, as is a lot of the individuals who are introduced in the later two books in terms of viewpoint characters. I also think that there is a slight advantage to him surviving, given the fact that he is not near any other viewpoint character, and Martin tends to like to kill characters who are near other characters. I meant to bring this up in Aeron's perspective, but it doesn't seem great for him that he's so near to Sam, who could witness his death. But Areo being on his own does make me think there is at least somewhat of a chance of his survival. I'll put Areo Hotah at about a 40% chance of his survival, as Darkstar is very dangerous, and I don't think anyone could survive an encounter with him. Keeping the train rolling with some Dornish point of views, we have Arianne Martell, the princess who is currently on the highway to the danger zone. She is headed directly to Storm's End as of her last sample chapter for the Winds of Winter, and assuming success at Storm's End, which I think is pretty likely, her and Aegon's cause will probably march on King's Landing and claim it for themselves. While she is heading into these danger situations where there's likely to be battle and some political scheming around her, I don't think she's particularly likely to die in the Winds of Winter. A lot of the schemers at play are people who are trying to advance her position specifically. I'm looking at the Sand Snakes, Duran, her father, as well as individuals who might want to keep Dorne in the fold, like Jon Connington and the entirety of Aegon's cause. So I think that while she is maybe likely to die in the Winds of Winter, or not the Winds of Winter, sorry, A Dream of Spring, if she is to end up on Daenerys' bad side, I do think she's quite likely to survive the Winds of Winter. I'd put her survival chances at around 75%. Arriving now at the first Stark point of view, I think that Arya is an interesting case. I don't particularly think that any of the Stark kids who are viewpoints are going to die in this series as a whole, but if one of them were to do so, I would see it probably being Arya. Specifically, I could see her following a path similar to what we see in the show, where she is very depersonalized by House of Black and White, and ends up pursuing vengeance for its own sake until it essentially kills her, because this story, being written by George R. R. Martin rather than D&D, would be much more likely to have Arya be a cautionary tale than oh, she's so cool, she's killing people, it's great. But overall, I think that Arya has about a 95% chance of surviving the Winds of Winter, and that is one of the lower Stark kids that we'll get to. Asha Greyjoy is a bit of an interesting case. I do think that either her or her brother Theon is quite likely to die in the Winds of Winter, but I do go back and forth on which is going to be the one to do so. At this point, I think Asha might be slightly less likely. We do know from the Asha fragment, which is a portion of a chapter we can see in an old episode of John Oliver, that she does end up in the middle of Stannis' Battle of Ice, but given her prowess as a warrior, I'm unsure as to how exactly that might end up with her dead, other than maybe accidentally falling through the ice. That said, Theon is present for that, and I could see a strong case being made for one of the two dying at that point in the story. With that said, I think there is a stronger chance of Asha surviving than her brother, as Theon's story we'll get to in his section a bit more, but I think it's a bit more wrapped up than Asha's. Overall, I'd put Asha's chances of survival for the Winds of Winter at about 60%. Moving on to the character who inspired this video, sort of. Barristan Selmy is a very interesting case, and he is somewhat of the inspiration for this video. Back last year when I did a video about his potential death early on in the Winds of Winter, I initially thought, oh, I'll do this for all of the characters and examine how exactly they'll happen. But at the time, I just decided to focus on purely Barristan at that point, because I thought it'd be interesting to just go in depth on one character. If you want more details, be sure to check that video out, but in short, he's surrounded by very treacherous allies and very bad symbolism that make it seem quite likely that this great white knight is going to die in the Battle of Fire. So I put Barristan's odds of surviving the Winds of Winter at about 10%. That might be high, maybe 7%. As much as I hate to say it, Bran's going to be king at the end of the story. That's 100% survival rate. His mind might not survive. He might get taken over or fully robotified, but Bran's going to live, unfortunately. I think Brienne of Tarth is a character who is very unlikely to die as well. I think she's so purely good that I think she'll be pretty fine, and I also think she has enough skills in combat to pretty reasonably save her in any kind of situation. There are other situations where I can see her sacrificing herself, perhaps mirroring whatever her ancestor Duncan the Tall does at Summerhall, and I could see her death maybe being used for Jaime's arc to progress it forward, but overall I think if somebody in that arc is going to die, it's much more likely to be either Jaime or Cersei. Brienne seems like a pretty good character and a pretty solid pick to make it through the entire story. I would put her chances of survival at about 85%. And hey, if you want more speculation on the Winds of Winter and deeper analysis on A Song of Ice and Fire, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I do this stuff all the time, and I'd really appreciate any support on this video and on the channel as a whole. Speak of the devil and she will appear. Cersei Lannister, I do not think is very likely to survive Winds. I think she's definitely not going to survive both Winds and Dream. I think there's a slight chance she makes it to Dream, but overall I think it's quite unlikely. She is currently in King's Landing with no allies and waiting her trial by combat, where she is being championed by a man who's supposed to be dead and is likely to face scrutiny from all sides no matter what happens. Lannister power in King's Landing is waning. The Tyrells don't like her. The Faith doesn't like her. Aegon probably won't like her. She's probably going to end up having to flee back to Casterly Rock, as Martin has said that we will have a viewpoint there at some point in the books. But overall, I think that Cersei is pretty like to die in this book. I would put Cersei's chances of survival around 25% for the Winds of Winter. Daenerys Targaryen, often cited as the Fire in the A Song of Ice and Fire, is a fairly strange case in terms of the book series and the television series. I'm not entirely sure that she's going to get old Yellard like she did in the television show, but I do think it's pretty likely that Dany doesn't survive the entirety of the series. With that said, I would be utterly shocked if Martin killed her off in the Winds of Winter. I think if Daenerys Targaryen is going to die, she's going to have to die in A Dream of Spring towards the very end of the book series. That said, her current situation does have her potentially dying of dysentery on the Dothraki-Oregon Trail, so overall I'd put her chances of survival for the Winds of Winter similarly to Arya's at about 95%. Davos is a bit of a coin flip for me. I think he's a very good person. He's somebody who pretty much everybody who reads the books likes, and I'm sure that Martin likes him as well. He's very much an everyman who has gotten himself out of so many incredibly weird situations and keeps appearing to die, but not dying. I think that if Martin really wanted to gut punch his readers, a Davos death might be a good way to do so. And given the fact that he's going to a cannibal island, he's not necessarily going to be the most safe in the Winds of Winter. But with that said, I still don't think it's very likely that Davos will die in the Winds of Winter. He will likely be trying to return to Stannis, and Stannis is going to be facing some trouble of his own. I think that the fact that Davos later turns to Jon as a figure to follow might be a note from Martin, in that it seems pretty likely in terms of leadership in the North after a potential Stannis defeat or death. And I think that Davos could have a pretty big role to play in terms of convincing people of something or other in The Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring. I'd put his survival chances at 75%. The man with the hand, we have Jaime Lannister. I think that he's more likely to survive than Cersei, but I also think they're pretty likely to die together, especially if he's the Valonqar. I think that Jaime is headed into a very dangerous situation, given that he is about to go meet Lady Stoneheart and her merry band, and she does not like him very much. But I also don't think that's going to be how Jaime dies in the books. I think that he has a lot more story left to tell, and I think that while a confrontation with Lady Stoneheart could be very climactic for his arc, I think there is still very much a road left to travel for him after that. I'd put his chances of survival of the Winds of Winter, this is kind of lame and literally just a coin flip, at about 50%. I think he's less likely to survive Dream, but I think that he's got about a coin flip's chance to survive the Winds of Winter. Jon Connington has a 100% chance to survive. I do not want to hear anything else. He's perfect. He's going to be fine. He's going to be fine. They're going to find a cure for grayscale. It's going to be great. He's going to do fine. Realistically, I don't think Jon Connington is dying in the Winds of Winter. And that's a hot take. I think he's definitely dead by the end of the series. But I do think that his death is going to be in A Dream of Spring. Specifically because I think the order of operations from how the show played out is going to play out the same in the books. Specifically that Daenerys is going to first turn her gaze northward, fight the others, and then come south to take the Iron Throne. I think later in A Dream of Spring is going to be when her conflict with Aegon begins and ends, and I think that is where Jon Connington is going to have the whole Bells incident and where he's likely going to die, maybe after starting a grayscale plague. So overall, in terms of the percentage chance of Connington dying in the Winds of Winter, I'm going to have him at about 65% chance of survival because he is contracted with a deadly disease, but I believe in him, and you should too. Jon Snow is dead at the beginning of the Winds of Winter, so I think I kind of have to give him a 0% on a technicality, but I do think he's very likely to survive this book upon resurrection, if that even happens. I have heard more talk recently of, oh, maybe Jon won't be resurrected, but I don't think that's the case. I think Martin's been setting up this resurrection pretty well, and he's not one to subvert his own setup just for the sake of it. I think Melisandre is pretty likely to go out in a blaze of magical glory, whatever that may be, and I think that blaze of glory is going to happen in the battle against the others, not dissimilar to the show, but I think that hopefully it'll be better than the show, as there tends to be a lot more kind of direct and more kind of magic spectacle rather than just, oh, we'll light all these swords on fire and then I'll die from that about 12 hours later. I think that there will be some grand sacrifice. She may even sacrifice herself, and we'll get to see that through someone else's eyes, be it Davos's or Jon's or somebody else's. I think Melisandre has about a 35% chance of surviving the Winds of Winter. I think Sansa's probably going to survive the series as a whole. She's pretty safe right now. She's up in the Vale with Littlefinger, and overall, other than potential assassins that Littlefinger might incur, there really isn't much that could really endanger her. I know she's getting more into broader politics, and is likely to probably kill Littlefinger if that one vision that Arya was privy to in A Storm of Swords is to be believed. But overall, I think she's a character who is going to be rebuilding the world after A Dream of Spring. I think that Martin has very much set her up as one of these late game political players who might be one of the final ones to survive on account of the lessons she learned from the previous players like Littlefinger. I think that Sansa has, I'd say, a 99% chance of surviving the Winds of Winter. And that 1% I think is I don't know, it's very unlikely. Maybe it's 100%. I'm going to stick with 99 just in case I'm wrong. I really don't think Samwell's that likely to die either. I think that he's probably going to be one of the characters that survives the series as well. I think that he's very much set up to be this record keeper, potentially a Grand Maester on the council. That was one of the council places I did not quite mind as much in terms of the Game of Thrones final council. Bronn being on there was a great choice, I think, really inspired by D&D. But I think that Samwell is a character who's enough of an important person, but not really a warrior, so he wouldn't really hopefully be involved in those battles. But as we've seen, he's survived encounters with White Walkers before, so I think that he very much could have the tools he needs to get through the Winds of Winter and survive even A Dream of Spring. I would put Samwell's likelihood of surviving the Winds of Winter at about 90%, given the fact that he is likely to go back to the north, but I think that he will more than likely survive that trip. I think Theon's a lot less likely to survive the Winds of Winter than his sister. I think his arc is very much completed. He's reclaimed his name. He is himself once again, and perhaps he's going to be able to die to give his sister a better chance at life. The important thing about Theon is that he could invalidate the Kingsmoot. That's his main narrative purpose going forward. But given the fact that he might have a child already, given the captain of the Miriam's potential grandchild, as I talked about in my Captain Kingmaker theory. I think that Theon's survival is not something that is necessary to the story at all, and given the presence of his sister Asha right nearby, I think he's very likely to die in the Battle of Ice, perhaps as a sacrifice on the Weirwood Isle in order to power up Lightbringer and blind the Freys and the Manderleys, hopefully sending them crashing through the ice. I would put Theon's survival chance for the Winds of Winter at about 25%, given the fact that Asha could also be the character that dies at the Battle of Ice, if anyone dies at the Battle of Ice, or there could be a false sacrifice, perhaps one of the treacherous Karstarks, rather than Theon himself. Tyrion's an interesting one. We already know that his story in the Winds of Winter is done. It's the only story that Martin has confirmed that he's completely finished with at this point in terms of the development as of this video being written in, what is it, February of 2024, almost March of 2024. So we know that his arc is complete. That said, I don't think that necessarily means his arc is very short. Tyrion tends to have a lot of chapters, and he is Martin's favorite character to write, so I don't think Martin's going to kill him off any earlier than he possibly has to. I could see Tyrion not surviving the series. I could see him dying in A Dream of Spring if he were to kill his siblings or maybe make too many enemies, which he's already doing a lot of at present. I think that there could be some potential of him dying there, but I cannot see Martin killing Tyrion off anytime prior to the very end of the story or close to it. I would put Tyrion's chance of survival at 99%. Last, but certainly not least, we have the stump that was promised, Victarion Greyjoy. I've made a video on his inability to die in the past, but will the Winds of Winter be any different? I don't know. I don't think he's going to die in the Battle of Fire. I think that, maybe there's a 10% possibility he dies in the Battle of Fire, but I think there is more to Victarion that could be going on after that, and I could see him serving as Daenerys' chief admiral and continually pushing her down this darker and more savage path. Whether or not I think Greyjoy Bowl will appear in the Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring is up for debate. I personally think it's more likely for the Winds of Winter, and I do think that there is more likelihood than not that Victarion might not make it out of this book alive. That said, I think I probably would have said that about A Feast for Crows and about A Dance with Dragons, and I would love to be proven wrong. I would put Victarion's chances of survival from the Winds of Winter at about 40%, which I think is probably higher than most people would put him. So this has been all of the viewpoint characters and how likely I think they are to survive the Winds of Winter. What do you think? Have I placed anybody too high, too low? Do you think anybody's sure to die, definitely safe? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. While you're down there, leave a like, subscribe, all the typical YouTube stuff. I have many more videos coming for you in the very near future, and I hope you can stick around to see all of them. All kinds of A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, and Game of Thrones stuff, and I'm very excited to share more with you in the very, very near future. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you all soon. Goodbye!